Do you guys remember the Konami Rebirth trilogy? It was released on WiiWare exclusively in 2009. It was essentially a reimagining of 3 of Konami's most famous franchises, Gradius, Contra, and Castlevania. Now when I say these were WiiWare exclusives, I mean it, because to this day, none of these games have seen another release. Not as standalone titles, not in any collections, nope. Ever since the Wii Shop channel closed down, these games are 100% impossible to buy, so unless you have them on a Wii or Wii U like I do, you're kinda screwed. Now, I downloaded all 3 of these games back in the day, but I really only played Castlevania. Gradius was never really my jam, and Contra was, to be quite frank, too hard for me to play most of the time, so I stuck to what I knew best, which is incredibly ironic, and we'll get back to that later. Anyways, I wanted to make a video to give myself an excuse to replay these games again, because I remember them being quite good, and spoiler alert, yes, they are quite good. Now let's start with Gradius. Like I said before, I'm not really much of a Gradius person. Be that as it may, I find this to be a perfectly good 2D shooter. It's absolutely nothing special, but it's a fair bit of fun. Gameplay-wise, there are a couple innovations here, at least I think. Like I said, I've never really been a big Gradius person. But you can pick up tokens after defeating lines of enemies, and you can use those to either level up your ship or one of the weapons on them, depending on how many you're holding. I really like that idea. It gives you sort of a risk versus reward gimmick, because after you die, all that shit gets reset. Speaking of dying, when that does inevitably happen, because let's face it, this is a 2D Konami game, they're kinda hard, you're reset at the nearest checkpoint, and this game's got plenty of them, which is awesome. It gives a lot of incentive to keep playing. It's not all perfect though, the level design could use some work. There's one part in this cave area where the walls keep closing in on you and you're sort of forced to the right, and then these bubbles come out of nowhere and they sort of pin you. This is avoidable by hanging back your ship a little bit, upgrading your weapon, and blasting away at the walls, but how are you supposed to know that? Aside from that, there's not a ton I can say about Gradius Rebirth. It's Gradius. You've definitely played this before if you've played any other Gradius game. It's got some nice quality of life improvements, I love the additional checkpoints, but that's just about it. Now let's move up to Contra Rebirth. Now honestly, I wasn't expecting much out of this one, because I've never really liked the Contra series. To me, games like Contra and Ghosts and Goblins will always be arcade coin munchers, developed specifically to be as hard as possible for arcade gamers so they keep putting quarters in the machine and drain their wallets. I am very happy to say though, Contra Rebirth is absolutely nothing like that. Firstly, I love the 80s action movie aesthetic they're going for, despite the fact that this is also supposed to be sort of a Super Nintendo / Genesis aesthetic. Everything just sort of feels like an 80s over-the-top action movie, and I absolutely love that, especially the intro. As you'd expect, you play as Bill Reiser in this game, the famous glass cannon of video games. He can dish out a ton of pain, but he only needs 1 bullet to put himself down. Frustrating enough, despite the fact that this game has a difficulty select and you can give yourself additional lives, you can't give yourself a health bar, which is something that I feel Contra's always desperately needed. Aside from that, it's fucking Contra, dude. It's badass. You're running around with a machine gun blasting the shit out of everything in sight. The best part is they added a new weapon called the homing rocket, where you essentially don't even have to aim at the enemies, the bullets just get attracted to them, kind of like Sonic's homing attack. To call this move broken would be to call a nuke a fucking hand grenade. Of course it's broken. You're shooting literal rockets at every possible direction. It's like the spread fire on goddamn steroids, and I absolutely love that. Despite the fact that I've always disliked Contra specifically because of its abhorrent difficulty, this game strikes a nice easy balance, and it has a very slight difficulty curve to it that's, I think, fun, yet punishing. Up until the 3rd level boss. How the hell do you defeat this guy? I'm still stuck on him. That brings us to Castlevania the Adventure Rebirth, a reimagining of not the original Castlevania series, but the Game Boy Castlevania series. Yeah, they're specifically calling this one Castlevania the Adventure Rebirth. Now, the Game Boy Castlevania series didn't need to be rebooted, they needed to be goddamn exercised. But let's see how well the Rebirth treatment did. This is Castlevania the Adventure Rebirth, released on December 28th, 2009. It follows the story of Christopher Belmont, an ancestor of Simon Belmont who has to whip Dracula into shape just like Simon did years prior. Gameplay-wise, it's classic Castlevania to a T. It feels exactly like the NES games and Bloodlines, and I mean that in a good way. Castlevania has always had sort of a stiff yet fun control style to it. And the good news is, the stiffness is pretty much taken away. You can restore it with an option in the menu, but when this option is disabled, knockback is completely negated, and Christopher Belmont, unlike Simon and Richter, can actually control his jumps in midair. My god, this is weird. It's not a bad weird though. It's not like when your uncle touches you under the table at Thanksgiving. It's a good weird. It's like when you're playing a classic retro game patched for the new age, because that's kind of what's going on. Unfortunately, Castlevania the Adventure Rebirth suffers from the difficulty curse that the other 2 games didn't have. When you get to level 3, your ass will get slapped to goddamn Jupiter. Even with no knockback, even being able to control your jumps in midair, the level design and enemy placement is just fucking why? Why do the red skeletons regenerate themselves so quickly? Why do I have to jump in between these stupid fucking spikes? This is classic Castlevania level design at its absolute worst, and to top it all off, personal preference here, it's not a Metroidvania, which in my opinion doesn't really make any sense. I've gone into this in other videos, but I just feel like the Metroidvania style of Symphony of the Night and the Game Boy Advance trilogy is the way to go. You have a progression system, RPG elements, but because this is aping the original 8-bit games, and I guess technically the Game Boy games, all of that shit's gone. But Danny, I hear you say, this isn't meant to be a callback to the Metroidvania games, this isn't meant to be a callback to the original Castlevania games. And sure, it's a callback to the first two. I hope you weren't expecting different playable characters like in Castlevania 3 or Bloodlines, or an omnidirectional whip like in Castlevania 4. None of that is here. It is bare bones Castlevania 1 and 2 gameplay, minus the RPG elements of Castlevania 2. It's got great visuals, an outstanding soundtrack comprised of some of my favorite remixes in the series' history, and a fun gameplay loop, but at the end of the day, it's just too fucking hard, and in my opinion, it regresses too far. I get wanting to go back to basics with the Rebirth series, and I think Contra and Gradius do that really well, but with Castlevania, I mean, you had a really well-established gameplay formula that you were ignoring at this time, Konami. Why wouldn't you just do that? With all that said, don't let me discourage you from playing this. It's still a fun Castlevania game that I think 99.9% of Castlevania fans are going to eat up. It'll appease the classic fanboys, although I think the Metroidvania games do that perfectly fine, and it'll appease the Game Boy fanboys, which are, I mean, who they were appealing to in the first place. Because of that, I think that it still succeeds as a Rebirth title, even though it's not personally my cup of tea. I'll go back and play the Game Boy games over this, but I still think it's a pretty fun game at the end of the day. Just way too hard. I guess that really sums up Konami in a nutshell anyways, huh? Really fun titles, just really fucking hard. But at the end of the day, difficulty is subjective. Most people seem to enjoy these titles, and for good reason. These are 3 quality titles that shouldn't have been abandoned on the WiiWare system. Nobody can play these now unless you put on an eye patch and sail the 7 seas, or find a Wii with this game preloaded on it, which I think is incredibly fucking tragic. Konami have since released both Contra and Castlevania collections on systems like the Nintendo Switch and PlayStation 4, but none of them have had the Rebirth games on them, and I honestly think that's a bit depressing. These are high quality titles. I mean, it says a lot when the only complaints I have about them are personal gripes against them. The gameplay, the structure, the graphics, the sound, it's all pretty much flawless from what I can tell. Are they ball-bustingly hard? Yes, but they're Konami games. If they weren't, we'd have a problem here. And overall, I think that these games deserve a second shot. Throw them on the PlayStation Network, throw them on the Nintendo Switch eShop. They'll sell. Konami, trust me. And for everyone else, peace out and take care.